In the late summer of 1889, a small Comanche hunting party rode down into the eastern arm of Palo Duro Canyon, looking for the last of the Mustang herds that still watered along the prairie dogtown fork of the Red River. There were only a handful of them. The great days were 15 years gone. The buffalo were gone with them. Most of their people were penned on the reservation up at Fort Sill, in what everyone now called Indian Territory, and a man who rode out to hunt in 1889 was riding through the ruins of his own world. A flash flood had come through the week before. In canyon country the water does not soak in. It runs, and it strips, and it moves whole hillsides of sand in a single afternoon, then vanishes and leaves the ground scoured down to whatever lies beneath. One of the hunters, a younger man, was leading his horse across a low bench where the flood had cut a fresh channel, and the horse stopped. It would not put its foot down. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. He pulled, and the animal set its weight back and refused, and when he crouched to see what had spooked it, he saw that the horse was standing on stone, not the broken red rock of the canyon walls. Flat stone, fitted stone. A surface laid by hands, running straight out from under the sand in both directions. He called the others over, and they cleared the loose sand away with the edges of their hands and the flat of a knife, and what came up out of the ground was a paved street. That is where this begins, and before we go any further, understand what a claim like that actually costs, because in 1889, on that particular piece of ground, a paved street was not a wonder, it was a problem. It was a legal problem, an economic problem, and a problem for the entire story the United States was telling itself about the land it was in the middle of handing out. To see why, you have to understand where they were standing, and what had just been done to make it theirs. Palo Duro is the second largest canyon in the country. It cuts down through the flat top of the Texas Panhandle so suddenly that a man can ride the plains for a week and never know it is there until he is at the rim. The Spanish who crossed this country in 1541, under Coronado, gave the whole tableland above it a name that has never been fully explained. They called it the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, or the Palisaded Plains. Historians have argued for centuries about that word. Some say the early travellers drove stakes to find their way back across a grassland with no landmarks. Some say the escarpment looked like a palisade wall. And some have always wondered, quietly, whether the name recorded something the namers actually saw. Stakes already in the ground, lines already run. Because a man does not name a place after markers, unless there are markers. Coronado himself did not come here for grass. He came chasing a story. He had been told of Quivira, a kingdom on the plains rich enough to make the conquest of Mexico look small, and he marched across the Llano looking for cities, and the guides who led him were plains people the Spanish called Teyas and Querechos, who lived out on that ocean of grass in ways their conquerors could not account for. Coronado found no golden kingdom, and history has laughed at him for chasing one. But history rarely stops to ask why a hardened conquistador, who had already seen real cities in Mexico, believed there were cities out here at all. Somebody told him there were, and he crossed 1,000 miles of the exact country we are standing in to find them. The Comanche had held this land for 150 years before 1889, and they did not think of themselves as its first people. Their own accounts spoke of those who came before, and of things in the canyon that were old when the Comanche were new. The country under their feet held proof that human beings had worked it for a very long time. Not far north, at the Alabates quarries above the Canadian River, there is a bed of rainbow flint people mined for 13,000 years. That is not a figure of speech. 13,000 years of quarrying and trade, of stone from that single panhandle ridge turning up in tools 1,000 miles away in every direction. This was never empty land. It was one of the oldest continuously worked landscapes on the continent, and everyone who actually lived on it knew that. But by 1889 a different story had been imposed on it, and the imposition was recent, and it was violent. In 1874, the United States Army came down into Palo Duro after the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Cheyenne who had gathered in the canyon for the winter. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie found the encampment on the canyon floor, drove the people out on foot up the walls, burned their lodges and their entire winter store of food, and then did the thing that actually ended the war. He took their horses, more than 1,000 of them. He marched them to Tule Canyon and had them shot, the whole herd, so they could never be recovered. A people who lived by the horse were set afoot in the cold, with nothing to ride and nothing to eat. That was the end of Comancheria. The last free bands, including those under the war leader Quanah Parker, came into the reservation the next year. Quanah would spend the rest of his life as a rancher and a negotiator, moving between two worlds, and he would live long enough to ride in a president's inaugural parade. Within 2 years of the horse killing, the canyon that had been the beating heart of a native empire belonged, on paper, to a cattleman. And there is a colder economic layer under the horse killing, one that is rarely named. The Comanche Empire had run on a resource, the buffalo, and the buffalo did not simply wander off. They were destroyed on purpose. Commercial hide hunters, backed by the railroads that carried the skins east, slaughtered the southern herd down from millions to almost nothing in a single decade. A general of the era said it plainly, that the hide men had done more to defeat the plains tribes than the whole army, and should be left to it until the buffalo were gone. Starve the herd, and you starve the nation that lives on it, and then the land it lived on falls open, unowned, ready to be priced. The emptiness of the panhandle was not discovered. It was manufactured, animal by animal, on a schedule, for a market. His name was Charles Goodnight. In 1876 he drove his herd down into Palo Duro, ran the wild game out, and founded the J.A. Ranch on the canyon floor. Within a few years the J.A. ran more than 100,000 head across more than 1 million acres. And Goodnight was only the beginning. Above the rim, the state of Texas was carrying out the single largest land transfer in its history. To pay for the construction of its new Capitol building in Austin, Texas handed a syndicate of investors 3 million acres of the Panhandle in one stroke. That became the XIT Ranch. 3 million acres, strung with the new barbed wire, in a place that on every map in every land office was marked with one word: vacant, public domain, unimproved. Now hold those two things in your mind at the same time. The land was being given away, by the millions of acres, on the sworn legal understanding that it was empty. And a hunting party had just uncovered a fitted stone street on the floor of the canyon at the dead center of all of it. The younger hunter and the others followed the pavement as far as they could that day, and what they described, in the account that survived, was consistent enough that it is worth setting down carefully. The stones were not round river rock. They were shaped. Flat slabs, squared at the edges, set so tightly against one another that a knife blade would not go down between them. The surface was level enough that water stood on it in a sheet after the flood instead of draining through the joints. Along one side ran a raised edge, a curb, a single course of stone standing a hand higher than the road. And down the center, cut into the pavement itself, ran a shallow channel, as if the builders had wanted the rain carried off in a chosen direction rather than left to pool. The road ran dead straight, not following the contour of the land the way a game trail or a wagon track does, bending around every rise and drop. Straight, the way a thing is straight, only when someone decided in advance where it had to go and then made the ground obey. They cleared it for the length of several horses, and it kept going, in under the sand at both ends, level and true, and then the light went and they made camp, and in the morning they rode out, because they were hunters with almost nothing left, and a buried street feeds no one. What happened to the account after that is the part that matters, and it is the part that always seems to happen. The story reached the ranch. In those years there was constant traffic between the reservation Comanche and the J.A. cowboys, some of it wary, some of it friendly, and one of the hands, remembered now only through a later letter, wrote that an old Indian had told him of a stone road the flood turned up in the East Canyon, laid like a town street, running under the sand where no town had ever stood. The cowboy went and looked, or said he did, and found the flood cut and some flat rock, though by then the sand had already begun to slide back over it. He mentioned it to a surveyor who was running lines for the railroad, because the Fort Worth and Denver had just reached the Panhandle in 1888, and there were survey crews everywhere, drawing the grid that would carve this country into saleable sections. And there the trail goes cold. There is no survey notation. There is no report. There is no marked section anywhere in the county records that reads anything other than the standard description of open range. If a professional surveyor stood on a fitted stone street in the Texas Panhandle in 1889 and understood what he was looking at, he wrote nothing down, or what he wrote did not survive, and you should ask yourself which of those is stranger. A surveyor's entire job was to record what was on the land. Improvements, structures, prior workings, anything at all that changed the value or the legal status of a section. A paved street is the single most consequential thing a surveyor could possibly find, because it means the land is not vacant, was never vacant, and cannot lawfully be treated as vacant. It would have stopped the grid cold. So either he did not understand it, standing right on top of it, or he understood it perfectly, and understood just as fast what it would cost to say so. And consider whose word it was that carried the story in the first place. The men who found the street were Comanche in 1889, which is to say they were prisoners of a lost war, confined to a reservation, wards of a government that did not regard them as citizens and would not for decades. Their testimony had no legal weight anywhere it mattered. A Comanche hunter could stand on a paved street and describe it in perfect detail, and there was no court, no land office, no survey board on earth where his account could have changed the status of a single acre. The one group of people who actually knew this country, who had the oldest and most direct claim to what lay in it, had been placed, deliberately, in the one position where their knowledge could do nothing. That is not an accident of the record. That is the design of it. The people most likely to know the truth had been made, in advance, the people least able to be heard. And here is the thing about that grid, because the grid is not innocent. The whole American West was divided up by a system called the Public Land Survey. The Jeffersonian grid, 1 mile squares run off of baselines and meridians, section after identical section, marching across the map without regard for a single feature of the actual ground. It is the most efficient tool ever invented for turning land into property, and it works by erasing everything underneath it. It imposes a blank grid of straight lines and numbered squares, and once it is down, the land is legally readable only in its terms. A river becomes a boundary, a canyon becomes a set of sections, and an ancient straight stone street, if it happened to run at an angle to the survey, became nothing at all, because there was no box on the plat to write it in. The grid was designed to see vacant land. Show it a civilization and it sees vacant land, because that is the only thing it was ever built to see. This is the point where the story stops being about one street and becomes about a pattern and about the people who have spent their lives tracing that pattern, because the men and women who look into these things have a name for what a Comanche hunting party found in 1889. They call it evidence of the world before the reset. Their framework goes like this. They believe that not very long ago, within the last few centuries, there existed across much of the world an advanced civilization that has since been almost entirely erased from the record. They point to the buildings no one can quite explain, whose ground floors sit below the current street level, whose original doors and first windows are half buried, as if the whole city had been dug down out of the earth rather than built up on it. They call this the mud flood, a sudden burial of a prior world under a layer of earth, from which the survivors climbed out and into which the true history sank. They point to the star forts, the same 8-pointed geometric fortress design repeated on every continent, in places that supposedly never had contact. They point to the great exhibitions of the 1800s, the White City of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, an entire metropolis of domed marble palaces, we are told, was raised in 2 years out of temporary plaster and then deliberately demolished. And they ask the question that sits underneath all of it, what if those buildings were not built for the fair? What if they were already there, and the fair was the story invented to explain them and to justify tearing them down? And they make one more observation that is harder to dismiss than the rest, because it is about behavior rather than architecture. When something genuinely anomalous does surface, a skeleton that is too tall, an artifact in the wrong stratum, an inscription in a script that should not exist on this continent, it very rarely ends up on display. It ends up catalogued and shelved. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back, and quietly forgotten in the basement of an institution. Not destroyed, just filed where no one will look. The pattern is not a bonfire. The pattern is a storeroom. And a storeroom is exactly what you would expect from an economy that can neither burn the evidence nor afford to show it. You do not have to believe a word of that. Set the whole framework aside if you want to. But notice what it is actually doing, because underneath the mud floods and the star forts there is a harder and more serious idea, and it is an economic idea. The claim is not really about architecture. The claim is that history is property, that the story of who was here, and what they built, and how advanced they were, is not a neutral record kept by disinterested scholars. It is the deed, and whoever controls that deed controls what is possible, what is ownable, and who owes what to whom. And Texas hands the pattern one more piece, one that has nothing to do with any canyon. East of Dallas there is a town and a county that were both named for a thing found in the ground. When the first settlers dug their wells in the 1850s, they hit a wall, a buried wall of regular, joint-fitted stone blocks, running in straight lines and right angles deep beneath the prairie, at a place with no history of anyone building a wall. They named the settlement Rockwall after it, because it looked exactly like what the name says, masonry. For 170 years, geologists have called it a natural sandstone dike, and rock can indeed fracture into oddly regular shapes. And for just as long, the people who have stood in the excavations and put their hands on the courses have refused to be satisfied, because the blocks look laid, the corners look turned, and the whole structure runs for miles under a town named, to this day, after the impossibility of it. One buried wall can be a trick of geology, but the plains keep producing these, and the record keeps having no place to put them. Which brings us back to the floor of Palo Duro, and to why a stone street was a problem and not a wonder. The entire legal machinery that transferred the American West rested on a single doctrine, and the doctrine has a name: terra nullius, nobody's land, land belonging to no one. The idea, carried into American law and policy, and repeated in 10,000 land office documents, that the country west of the settled line was, in the eyes of the law, empty, unowned, available. Not the country of a people with cities and roads and law, but wilderness, waiting to be improved. You could not simply take a civilization's homeland. That would be conquest, and conquest creates obligations that outlive it, treaties, debts, rights that do not go away. But you could settle empty land. You could homestead vacant land. You could grant it and syndicate it and lay railroads across it and owe no one anything because there had been no one there. Emptiness was not a description of the West. Emptiness was its price. And this was never only a Texas arrangement. Across the whole country, the same doctrine was doing the same work on an almost unimaginable scale. Through the Pacific Railway Acts and the grants that followed, the federal government signed over on the order of 130 million acres of the public domain to the railroad companies in the checkerboard of alternate sections that still patterns Western land today. That transfer, among the largest movements of land into private hands in history, depended on the same premise, that the land was public, meaning empty, meaning no one's, meaning the government's to give. A civilization under the sand was not a footnote to that arrangement, it was a hole beneath the whole foundation. A paved street breaks that, completely. A fitted stone road with a curb and a drainage channel, running dead straight under the panhandle sand, is not wilderness. It is infrastructure. It is the signature of a society that surveyed and planned and built to last, on the exact ground that a syndicate had just been handed 3 million acres of, on the understanding that it was unimproved public domain. The street is not merely an archaeological curiosity, it is a rival claim. It says, someone was here, at a level of civilization the whole legal story insists was impossible on this continent, and if that is true, then the ground was never nobody's, and if the ground was never nobody's, then everything downstream of it, Every grant and every deed and every fortune built on Panhandle land is standing on a falsehood. That is why a surveyor writes nothing down, not because a man in an office ordered him to, but because he understood, the way everyone in that economy understood without being told, that some things are worth far more buried than dug up. The value of the entire Panhandle depended on it being empty. A man who proved it was not empty was not making a discovery. He was destroying property, his own and everyone's around him. Before we go on to what became of the canyon, stop for a second on the timing, because it is almost too clean. The horses were shot in 1874. The land was declared vacant and granted away all through the 1880s. The railroad grid arrived in 1888. The street surfaced in 1889, and within a single human lifetime, the physical ability to ever go back and check the story was systematically removed. Not by some grand conspiracy in a locked room, but by the ordinary, relentless forward motion of an economy that had every reason in the world not to look. Here is how the ground itself was closed. Goodnight's cattle, and the XITs, and every herd that came after grazed the canyon floor down to the roots and let the wind and the flood rework the loose surface year after year, so that any pavement not anchored under solid rock was buried and reburied a dozen times over. The plains above were broken to the plough in the great wheat expansions, and a ploughed section keeps no memory of anything. Then, in the 1930s, the state made the upper canyon into a park, and the Civilian Conservation Corps came in and built the road down into it. The cabins, the trails, they moved an enormous quantity of earth and stone. They cut and graded and paved with concrete, the modern way, straight across the canyon floor, and whatever older surface lay along the route of that new road was simply built over, the way older surfaces always are. Later came the dams and the reservoirs on the region's rivers, storing water over stretches of the low ground. Every one of these was an entirely reasonable thing to do: a ranch, a park, a road, a lake. And together they add up to a perfect erasure, carried out in good conscience, of the one kind of evidence that could have settled the question for good. Nobody had to hide the street. They only had to keep building, and the building did the hiding for them. Now, the honest case against all of this deserves to be made plainly, and I am going to make it, because the people who tell you stories like this almost never do. There are no photographs. In 1889, a hunting party did not carry a camera, and the flood that uncovered the street had already begun to bury it again within days. There are no recovered artifacts. Nothing was carried out. Nothing was measured with instruments. Nothing sits in a collection where you could go today and put your hand on it. The account comes down through second and third hands, an old man to a cowboy to a letter, and every hand it passes through is a hand that could have polished the story. The frontier ran on tales exactly like this: buried cities, lost white races, Spanish gold under every hill, and the overwhelming majority of them were precisely that: tales. Canyon country genuinely does contain flat, fractured stone that can look laid when it is only broken along a natural bedding plane. A tired hunter, a spooked horse, a slab of eroded rock, and 100 years of retelling can manufacture a paved street out of nothing but geology and the very old human hunger for a hidden truth. That is the plain, likely, deflating explanation, and any honest person has to keep holding it the entire time. But hold this alongside it. The deflating explanation requires the surveyor to have been fooled too, and surveyors were the one class of men on that frontier trained specifically to tell worked stone from natural stone, because their entire livelihood turned on the difference. It requires the curb to be an accident, and the central drainage channel to be an accident, and the dead straight line to be an accident, and all three accidents to occur together in one single feature, which is a very great deal of accident. And it sits inside a pattern that does not dissolve no matter how much of it you throw away, the unexplained name on the plains above. The cities Coronado crossed a continent to find because someone swore they were real. The 13,000 years of proven work at Alabates. The wall under rock wall that no one has ever managed to explain away to the satisfaction of the people standing in the hole. The Comanche insistence, waved off for a century, that others were here before them and built things now gone. And the convenient, total, and profitable forgetting of every account that pointed the wrong way. You can dismiss any one of these on its own. Dismissing all of them at once on the grounds that each is individually unproven, is itself a choice, and it happens to be exactly the choice that the economy of the past was built to make you feel is the only reasonable one available. Because that is the real subject here, not whether one street existed under one canyon. The subject is the economy of the past itself. History is not free. Someone always pays to have it told one way instead of another, and someone always profits from the telling. The story of the empty West, the vacant panhandle, the land belonging to no one, was worth an incalculable fortune to the men who received the land, and it cost an entire people every single thing they had. A paved stone street on the canyon floor was not evidence in some abstract academic sense. It was a liability on a balance sheet the size of Texas. And liabilities in that world, exactly as in ours, do not get investigated. They get written off. So the sand slid back over the fitted stones, and the cattle grazed above them, and the plough turned the plains, and the core poured its concrete, and the reservoir rose over the low ground, and the maps kept right on saying vacant, and the deeds kept transferring, and the fortunes kept compounding, all of it resting on the single word that the street, if anyone had chosen to dig it out and stand on it and say so out loud, would have turned into a lie. Empty. The Comanche who found it rode back to the reservation and into a history that had no room whatsoever for what they had seen, told by people who had every reason not to hear it, and the street is still there. It has to be, most of it, because a fitted stone road does not simply cease to exist. It only gets covered. Somewhere under the JA's old grass, under a park road, under stored water, and a century of blown sand, on the floor of the second largest canyon in America, there is a straight line of shaped stone, with a curb and a channel cut for the rain, running out into the dark in both directions. Exactly where it was laid by hands, the official record swears were never there at all. There is one last thing worth sitting with. Drive the Texas Panhandle today and the roads run straight. They run in long dead level lines for mile after mile, turning at hard right angles at the section corners, laid out on the grid without regard for the shape of the land, going where the survey said a road should go rather than where the ground invites one. And a Comanche hunting party in 1889 described a road already under that same ground that ran exactly the same way. Dead straight, level. Built to a plan the land itself did not suggest. We think we invented the straight road across these plains. The account says we were only the second people to lay one, running over the buried lines of the first, on a grid we told ourselves was empty. The sand did not destroy it. The sand only moved back over it. And a country that needed the ground to be empty was more than happy to leave it that way. Make of that what you will.